It is the 14th of July, 1789, and a crowd of about 1,000 people is gathering outside an imposing state prison known as the Bastille in Paris, France. The city has been in turmoil for the past few days, and the crowd wants what's inside: gunpowder. At around 1:30 p.m., shots are fired by the panicked defenders when the crowd moves to storm the prison. After several hours of intense fighting, the garrison surrenders despite suffering just one casualty. In contrast, some 98 attackers lay dead, with a further 73 wounded. The commander of the Bastille, now himself a prisoner, is then stabbed to death by the crowd, his head thereafter being placed upon a pike. This is the storming of the Bastille, and it marks the beginning of the French Revolution. In the late 18th century, King Louis XVI was on the throne of France, which was among the most powerful states in Europe. The kingdom, though, had to deal with a seemingly ever-growing list of problems. The state held massive debts, in part owing to the luxurious life of the French court and government spending in a recent conflict, the American War of Independence. Since losing their North American colonies would have been a significant blow to the British, France had a vested interest in making that happen. But it was rather expensive, with Paris spending somewhere in the range of 1.3 billion livres. The monarchy itself was also threatened by the ideals of the Enlightenment, which slowly were gaining popularity among French nobles, with whom there had always been a degree of mistrust. Ironically, this actually worsened because of the success of the American Revolution. And lastly, there was considerable discontent among the common people of France. The French population had grown from 18 million in 1700 to 26 million in 1789, making it one of the most populous states in Europe. That being said, poor harvests in the 1780s, culminating in the most severe winter in decades in 1788-1789, had brought food scarcity to as much as 80% of the population. In turn, this led to a drastic increase in the price of bread and other necessities, which impacted the growing urban population as much as it did the rural peasantry. Blame for these failures was placed squarely on the so-called Old Regime, and soon angry protesters began occupying parts of Paris completely unopposed by the army. In more than one instance, soldiers such as French guards during the storming of the Bastille even sided with the protesters. But we should not imagine the French Revolution like a single-day event, and from there on, France was a republic. It was a much slower, non-linear process, much of which occurred outside Paris itself in the French countryside. Here, people armed themselves in anticipation of an aristocratic conspiracy. But when this didn't materialize, the nobility became the target of popular anger, with rioters attacking castles and rural estates all over France. The Jewish population of the Alsace region also suffered greatly during this period of panic, which came to be known as the Great Fear. The National Constituent Assembly, a political body that formed in the early days of the Revolution after the Estates General became deadlocked in 1789, was now forced to react, and some weeks later they cancelled certain privileges of the nobility, such as compulsory labor, also known as corvée. And, while the feudal system remained in place, this was the first step of many in its eventual demise. A couple weeks later, on August 26, 1789, the Declarations of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was proclaimed by the National Constituent Assembly. Even though not explicitly mentioned, in practice these rights were limited to just men, not women. That is, despite a number of prominent voices calling for a decree that would give women equal rights as well. So, all that being said, you're probably thinking, wasn't the King of France against all this? And yeah, Louis XVI unquestionably wasn't happy about losing his grip on power. But at this point, he really didn't have a choice. Public opinion demanded change, and the king, not wanting to escalate the situation any further, more or less was compelled to go along with events. Importantly though, at this juncture, the majority of the population didn't want to abolish the monarchy itself, but rather reform it. Louis XVI was soon moved to Paris, leaving his royal court at Versailles. The king then approved a new constitution of France, which did not include universal suffrage. Rather, enfranchisement was limited to men older than 25 years of age who paid at least 3 livres in taxes. This development, while still unquestionably a step away from absolute monarchy, was not welcomed by everyone, including a Parisian lawyer named Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre belonged to a number of political clubs that had popped up in the latter half of the 18th century. In particular, though, he was a member of the so-called Jacobin Club, which had grown from its modest anti-royalist beginnings to become one of the leading voices of the Republican movement in France. Another famous club member was a certain Gilbert du Motet, better known by his title Marquis de Lafayette. A well-known aristocrat and military officer, Lafayette had previously fought in the American War of Independence, and he would also play a role in the French Revolution, as we will see. Anyway, despite introducing a number of modest reforms, the political climate in France continued to worsen. Louis XVI therefore planned to secretly escape Paris, and in 1791 he did exactly that. The king was soon found, however, and brought back to the French capital. What exactly he planned to do after leaving the city remains a matter of debate, with some historians believing he aimed to garner foreign support outside France itself for a multinational campaign to reinstall absolute monarchy, but this is purely speculation. Anyway, on July 15, 1791, the National Assembly decided not to depose the king. This was an unpopular decision, and some days later, the Cordeliers, a political wing, planned to gather on the Champ de Mars, a well-known public square in Paris. Directly in the center of the square was a monument called Altar of the Fatherland, and it was here they planned to gather votes in support of deposing the king. During this demonstration, 2 men were hanged, following rumors that they wanted to blow up the altar. The National Guard was called in, but finding the crowd mostly unarmed, they withdrew. Their presence, nonetheless, created unease amongst those in the square. At 6 p.m., the crowd had still not dispersed, and a new contingent of National Guardsmen showed up surrounding the square. They were led by the previously mentioned Lafayette, who displayed a red flag, a symbol that his men would soon act. From the crowd, a gunshot knocked Lafayette's hat from his head, which in turn caused the guardsmen to fire into the crowd in what later became known as the Champ de Mars Massacre. How many people died exactly is unknown. Previous estimates put the number at around 100, but nowadays it stands somewhere between 12 and 50 people. Lafayette was blamed for what many viewed as a wanton massacre, and rumors began to spread about foreign powers seeking to re-establish the full power of Louis XVI. This was not without reason. Many of France's neighbors actually had plans, rough plans, but still plans, to do exactly that. But they didn't want to act unilaterally. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II and Prussian King Frederick William II both did favor intervention, for instance, but Great Britain seemed unwilling to join them, so nothing really came of that, at least not right now. Meanwhile, though, in France, there were growing calls for war. This might sound strange at first, considering the situation, but different factions had their own goals here. For left-wing revolutionaries, a war could strengthen the revolution itself. In contrast, the Royalists and Louis XVI himself believed a war could bring about restoration of the monarchy, especially if France was to lose. And Louis XVI ultimately determined the country's foreign policy. As per the Constitution, he still possessed the power to approve war, which the king soon did. A suitable enemy was rather quickly found. No, it wasn't Leopold II, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, but Leopold II, King of Hungary and Bohemia. What? 2 Leopolds with the exact same name? No, it actually was the same person. Leopold held all the previously mentioned titles, but if France declared war on the emperor, it was almost certain other members of the Holy Roman Empire would come to his aid. However, in declaring war on the King of Hungary and Bohemia, this wasn't as likely. Before anything of significance occurred, though, Leopold II died, and his son, Francis II, inherited his titles, aside from that of emperor, which was officially granted to him some months later. Francis also would inherit the rather selective declaration of war, but crucially, he negotiated a military alliance with Prussia. Thus, on April 20th, 1792, the war began, and it really didn't go that well. The French lost battle after battle, and sometimes their troops retreated before the battle actually even began. Instead of strengthening the revolution, the war did the exact opposite, and rumors of conspiracy grew ever louder. Interestingly, and perhaps because of such dramatic losses, men of lower standing, aka non-nobles, were given more opportunities to quickly climb the ranks of the French army. This was to the benefit of a young man from Corsica, an island in the Mediterranean, who, somewhat recently, had lost his commission. The demand for capable fighters in the French army saw that he was recommissioned in 1793 and even became a general. From there, he would rise in rank until becoming one of the most popular faces of the French Revolution. And, rather ironically, he would also be the one who put an end to the First French Republic. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, but we'll talk more about him later. Anyway, as the war continued to go not so well, the political situation in Paris worsened. Louis XVI soon got into a feud with the Legislative Assembly and dismissed all ministers of the Girondin, one of the most powerful political groups in France at the time. Then, in a deeply unpopular move, he installed a new cabinet consisting mostly of the Feuillants, constitutional monarchists. And you know what? I just want to put it out here. I know my pronunciations are not perfect. I don't speak French, I'm in America, we don't have French fries, we have freedom fries, and let's just move on. The so-called sans-culottes, literally those without breeches, common people of the lower classes closely associated with the Jacobins, in turn demanded Louis XVI be arrested. Demonstrations became common outside the Tuileries Palace, Louis XVI's residence, and soon these transformed into a proper insurrection. On August 10, 1792, about 20,000 soldiers, along with a number of armed civilians, unexpectedly showed up prepared to arrest the king. Louis XVI, not wanting any bloodshed and rightly fearing for his life, decided to flee. Within the palace, some 900 Swiss guards, 2,000 soldiers from the National Guard, alongside a collection of noblemen remained, however, ready to defend their king. Most of the National Guard, though, surrendered as soon as the assault on the palace began. And, for a moment, it looked as though there wasn't going to be a violent confrontation. A cannonball was then fired by the unruly crowd outside. So, yeah, that wasn't going to happen anymore. Louis XVI tried sending the royalist forces orders to surrender, but it was too late. 600 supporters of the king died, while somewhere between 200 to 400 attackers lost their lives in the assault. What's more, a number of defenders who had surrendered were later killed by the mob, their body parts put on pikes and carried through the streets of Paris. Shortly afterwards, Louis XVI was himself arrested. This event, known as the Insurrection of 10 August, in effect marked an end to the monarchy in France, with around half the king's newly appointed members of the Legislative Assembly, perhaps seeing the writing on the wall, opting to leave the city. New reforms were then introduced. A new national convention was to be voted for under universal male suffrage, and that new convention would officially abolish the monarchy in France. The so-called Montagnards, or Mountain Men, a radical faction of the Jacobin deputies led by Robespierre, soon emerged as the preeminent governing force. And in contrast with the more moderate Girondins, they demanded still even greater societal change. Before that could happen, the still ongoing war, the War of the First Coalition, thrust itself back into the public's consciousness. Coalition forces had entered French territory and, following the Prussian capture of Verdun, the French began to panic. In Paris, prisons were stormed, and after initially killing those considered enemies of the revolution, the mob returned killing, well, basically anyone still left alive. Around 1,200 prisoners were killed over 5 days in what came to be known as the September Massacres. But then, on September 20th, news arrived that the Prussian army had been forced to retreat following the Battle of Valmy. A welcome relief to revolutionaries back in Paris. Just a day later, on September 21st, the monarchy was officially abolished, and the following day, the First French Republic proclaimed. Alright, so what now for Louis XVI? Well, the National Convention decided it would, in fact, be legal to bring him to trial. And so, the king was brought before a court and charged with basically all charges possible. From having attempted to subvert the revolution itself to conspiring with hostile foreign powers and his attempted escape, among other crimes. A fair trial was pretty much impossible in this context, and anything other than a guilty verdict would have resulted in further unrest. So, the once all-powerful King of France was declared guilty. A quote by Robespierre pretty much explains the French zeitgeist of the time. Louis has to die because the fatherland has to live. On January 21st, 1793, Louis Capet, the name Louis XVI received after having been stripped of his title, was then brought to the Palace of the Revolution and made to stand before the guillotine. Some 20,000 people had gathered to watch their former king's execution. For his part, Louis tried speaking to the crowd, saying, "People, I am innocent, I forgive," before being cut off by a drum roll. Louis was then executed, the guillotine quickly severing the former monarch's head, which was then shown to a cheering crowd, many of whom dipped their handkerchiefs in pooling blood to keep as souvenirs. A turning point in the French Revolution, the execution of Louis XVI was, likewise, a major provocation for other monarchies throughout Europe that had warned France against such action. Having previously received a declaration of war from the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont, a major regional power in Italy, Great Britain, Spain, and Naples all now declared war on the renegade French Republic. What's more, because the Netherlands was supported by Great Britain, France declared war on that country as well. So now Paris was basically at war with pretty much the entire European continent simultaneously. And you know, two-front, or in this case, multi-front wars are usually not a good thing. So the French government rather quickly had to figure out a strategy for dealing with the situation it now found itself in. But we'll be covering that in another episode.